The first night I drove down the winding, pine-lined road, I thought I was invisible. The headlights of my truck cut through the heavy fog like a knife, reflecting off the smooth, glassy surface of Lake Holstead. The town's gossip called this place cursed, abandoned, or worse, a haven for misfits. I called it freedom. For the first time in years, I was untethered, moving into a lake cabin that was far outside the reach of the HOA rules that had choked my life dry. I could feel their judgmental eyes already, as if the weight of 100 homeowners associations had followed me in a spectral cloud. But out here, on this secluded stretch of water, there was no HOA, at least that's what the realtor had promised. No letters demanding I paint my shutters beige neutral. No fine for having too many boats. No rule against letting my lawn grow wild like the forest it bordered. Just me, the cabin, and the lake. I parked the truck, got out, and breathed deeply. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and something else. Freedom. It wasn't like I had chosen this life out of whim. The HOA had become a slow poison in my previous neighborhood. Their relentless enforcement, their smug sense of superiority, had driven me into a corner. They had fined me for a mailbox that leaned slightly to the left. They had sent letters accusing me of visual blight because my garden was untamed. And when I protested, they laughed. Not a chuckle, not a smake, just a cold, corporate kind of laughter that seeped into your skin and made you question your own sanity. I was done with that world. Here, I could breathe. I could own my property without anyone telling me I had to paint the deck a specific shade of gray. I could dock my small boat, fire up my smoker, and let the lake swallow the noise of the world. The cabin itself was modest but sturdy. Weathered cedar siding, a stone chimney, and wide windows that looked out over the lake. It wasn't fancy, but it didn't need to be. The floorboards creaked under my boots in a way that made the cabin feel alive, almost welcoming. I set down my bags and walked to the edge of the water. The lake was a mirror, reflecting the clouds in slow, lazy movements. I ran my fingers over the smooth dock, imagining early mornings spent fishing, evenings with a drink in hand, the water lapping against the posts in perfect rhythm. Then came the first sign that the serenity wouldn't last. I noticed a small motorboat appear in the distance, weaving through the mist. I squinted, unsure if my eyes were playing tricks on me, until I saw it more clearly. The boat bore the unmistakable logo of the Holstead HOA. A dozen men and women, dressed in their crisp polos and shorts, moved with a purposeful arrogance that immediately set my teeth on edge. The boat stopped at a neighboring dock, and one of them waved in a way that was more territorial than friendly. I laughed bitterly. They had found me already. Out here, miles from the nearest paved road, they had sent their scouts. But how had they known I would dare move into a place outside their reach? And why did I feel the same thrill I used to feel when I outmaneuvered them in small HOA disputes, back in my old neighborhood? I walked back into the cabin, slamming the door behind me. I unpacked in silence, my mind running through every possible way they could try to assert control. I could almost hear the letters arriving, the fines, the threats. It was only a matter of time. They would try to make me bend, to break me, to make me submit to their arbitrary rules. But not here. Not this time. As darkness fell, the lake glimmered under the moonlight. I sat on the dock with a whiskey in hand, listening to the rhythmic hum of crickets and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the water's surface. That's when it hit me. Out here, I had leverage. They could send their boats, their lawyers, their letters, but they couldn't touch what I controlled, the docks. Every neighboring property, every tiny slip of waterfront they coveted, I could block or allow at will. The power dynamic was about to shift, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel fear. I felt anticipation. But anticipation was just a beginning. Revenge, like the lake beneath me, was slow-moving and patient, and I intended to let it rise like a tide, silently, steadily, until it swallowed them whole. I sipped the whiskey and let the thought settle. I had a question now that burned like fire in my chest. How far would they go to reclaim control, and could I turn their arrogance into their undoing? I didn't know the answer yet. I only knew that the lake was mine, the cabin was mine, and soon the docks would be mine too. A sudden knock at the door made me jump. Heart racing, I tiptoed to the cabin's entrance. Standing there, framed by the dim light of the moon, were two familiar faces, board members from the HOA, their smiles tight and forced. "Welcome to Halstead," one of them said. "We just wanted to check things out." I smiled slowly, a predator's smile, my mind already plotting. They didn't know it yet, but they had stepped into my world, and in my world, I didn't lose. I invited them in. The two board members stepped inside my cabin like they owned the place. That was the thing about HOA people. They moved with a confidence that was less earned and more inherited from the power they wielded over others. One was Travis, the HOA president from my old neighborhood, a man whose haircut looked like it had been approved by a committee. The other was Linda, the vice president, whose lips were permanently pursed as though she were constantly tasting something sour. Neither should have been here. Neither had any authority here. And yet they stood in my doorway, dripping arrogance onto my wooden floors. I gestured toward the small kitchen table. "Have a seat," I said calmly. Inside, though, my pulse drummed like thunder against my ribs. I didn't know why they were here, not exactly, but I knew it couldn't be good. The HOA never traveled without purpose. They didn't make casual visits. They arrived like storms, violent, invasive, and destructive. Travis sat down first, wiping his shoes on the rug without asking. Linda didn't sit at all. She stood with arms crossed, scanning my cabin as if cataloging each potential violation. "So," Travis began, clearing his throat, "we heard you moved out here." I leaned back in my chair. "Clearly. It's surprising," he said with a rehearsed smile. "Not many people choose cabins without rules." "That's the point," I replied. "No rules. No HOA. Just the lake, the woods, and some peace." His smile slipped for the briefest moment. "Well, about that," he said, intertwining his fingers on the table, "there seems to be some confusion." Linda finally spoke. "This region actually falls under the jurisdiction of the Halstead Lakeshore Maintenance Board." I raised an eyebrow. "Never heard of it." "You wouldn't have," she said briskly. "Most people don't until we reach out." The way she said it irritated me. The same tone she used years ago when she fined me for having a non-compliant wind chime. Back then, I accepted the fine with a clenched jaw. I wouldn't be doing that again. I folded my arms. Funny, the realtor said this cabin wasn't part of any HOA. "Oh, no, Travis said, waving a hand. "It's not technically an HOA. He emphasized the word as though that removed the stench. "It's just a governing body for community aesthetic standards, lake activity oversight, and shoreline management guidelines." "So," I said, blinking slowly, "an HOA with extra steps." Neither laughed. Linda pulled a folder from her tote bag and set it on the table with a crisp thud. "We'll need you to sign the membership agreement. You're required to maintain certain standards along your shoreline. Docks, boats, fences, everything needs approval." There it was, the demand, the expectation that I would kneel again. I didn't touch the folder. "That's not happening." Travis chuckled nervously. "It's mandatory." "No," I corrected. "It's mandatory only if this property is under your jurisdiction. And it's not." They exchanged a glance, but I continued before they could speak. I checked the county records. This cabin was exempted back when the maintenance board formed. Something about private land rights and easements. So unless you brought a legal document proving otherwise, you're wasting your time. For the first time, both looked stunned. Of course they didn't expect me to come prepared. They thought I would be compliant. They thought I would sign whatever they shoved under my nose. They thought I was the same man they used to bully. Linda narrowed her eyes. "You checked the records." "Before buying," I said, "always read the fine print." Travis cleared his throat, visibly scrambling for footing. "Well, even if the cabin is exempt, the docks aren't. They are part of the lake, and the lake is maintained by us. So you still fall under our authority." Ah, there it was. The docks, the one thing they wanted, the reason for this visit. Halstead Lake was a narrow, crescent-shaped body of water with only a few accessible docks deep in this corner. These HOA folks didn't own any land here, but their members used this lake for boating, water skiing, and weekend parties. They needed accessible docks, and lots of them. The cabin I purchased came with something rare, 4 dock slips. 4. More than any other property in the entire region. They didn't care about the cabin. They didn't care about me. They wanted control of my docks. I hid my smirk behind a neutral expression. Those docks are private property. Came with a deed. Yes, Linda said impatiently, but all docks on this lake must meet our design requirements, and they must be accessible for community use. So, I said slowly, you're trying to tell me that I bought private docks that aren't private. It's for the good of the community, Travis insisted. We ensure fairness. No resident should monopolize lake access. But I'm not a resident of your community, I reminded them. Remember? Their silence was delicious. I rose from the table and opened the door. I think this conversation is over. Travis stood, flustered. You don't understand how things are done out here. Oh, I understand perfectly. I pointed at the door. What you don't understand is that your board doesn't own me, and it doesn't own my shoreline. Linda's face flushed a dangerous shade of red. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Good, I said. I'd hate for you to think this was easy. They hesitated for a beat, then walked out onto the porch. The moonlight illuminated their stiff postures. Travis turned back. We'll be in touch. No, I said, leaning on the doorframe. You won't. I closed the door before they could respond. For a moment, I simply stood there, listening to the fading sound of their footsteps on the wooden planks. My heart pounded, but not from fear. No, this was something else. Something electric. Something satisfying. They had underestimated me. They assumed I'd break, like before. But now I held the cards. I controlled the docks. And Halstead Lake's HOA depended on them more than they wanted to admit. A smile crept across my face, slow and sharp. I walked down to the dock, letting the cool night air settle around me. The water shimmered in the moonlight like a dark promise. They thought they could storm in and claim what was mine. But they hadn't realized something yet. You can only push a man so far before he pushes back. Hard. This time, I wasn't just defending myself. This time, I was planning. Plotting, preparing. The lake was quiet, but my mind was loud with strategy. Their aggression was their weakness. Their need for control was their blind spot, and I was going to exploit every inch of it. They thought they knew warfare because they held clipboards and rulebooks, but I understood something they never would. Revenge isn't loud. It's patient, like water slowly rising, like a tide that drowns everything in its path. The morning after their visit, the lake was so still it looked frozen. Mist lingered above the surface like breath held too long. I walked out onto my dock with a cup of coffee and a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The HOA, whatever version of itself it pretended to be out here, had drawn first blood by storming onto my property, demanding compliance, demanding control. They wanted my docks, and they were about to find out they couldn't have them. The idea came to me as naturally as breathing. If the docks were the battleground, I needed to fortify them, not with weapons or fences, but with something far more effective: paperwork. The first rule of dealing with any HOA is simple: drown them in their own language. Bind them with the same bureaucratic chains they wore like armor. Give them so many hoops to jump through that they choke on the very rules they worship. Before leaving the cabin, I grabbed a notebook and made a list. Confirm county dock ownership rights. Review shoreline easements. Document dock condition, photo evidence. File for temporary renovation permits. Post publicly accessible compliance notices, even if unnecessary. The HOA would hate that. I drove into town, a sleepy little place where the diners still use handwritten menus and everyone knew everyone else's business. People stared as I walked onto the courthouse steps with notebooks, folders, and a USB full of documents. Maybe they weren't used to out-of-towners. Maybe they recognized HOA trouble when they saw it. The county clerk, a spectacled woman named Hazel, barely looked up when I approached. "Morning," I said. She replied, which I took as a greeting. "I need all records relating to property parcel 19 Lake 62, specifically easements, dock rights, and shoreline maintenance obligations." That made her look up. You moved into the Holstead cabin. Yes. The HOA bothering you already. I blinked. You know about them. She snorted. Everyone knows about them. They've been trying to swallow the entire lake for years. I already like Hazel. County exempted that land decades ago, she continued, typing rapidly. Found in your deed too. No HOA jurisdiction. No Lakeshore Board authority. You're clean. Is that something I can get in writing? I asked. She printed a stack of documents thicker than my arm. 5 certified copies. Make it 10. She smiled. As I drove back, the stack of paperwork sat on the passenger seat like a silent, loyal guard dog. They thought they could bully me again. They thought they could storm onto my land and claim what I bought with my own money. No, not this time. Back at the cabin, I spent nearly an hour posting laminated notices around my docks. Private property, dock renovation pending, access restricted under County Ordinance 47-8B. It was a legitimate ordinance. I checked. They had no authority to question it. Then I went a step further. On each post, I hung a QR code linking to a digital copy of the non-HOA compliance report I drafted. It detailed structural assessments, maintenance timelines, temporary access restrictions, legal documentation proving HOA exemption. If they touched my docks, stepped foot on them, or even breathed too close, I could document it as interference and file a complaint with the county. Let the HOA try to swim in that mess. By noon, my work was done. That's when I heard them. A motorboat, louder than necessary, like they wanted me to hear. I didn't react. Instead, I sat on my porch with a glass of iced tea and waited as the boat came into view. It was the same one from the night before, but this time it carried additional passengers, 6 of them, all wearing matching polos with a Lakeshore Board logo. And clipboards. Always clipboards. They pulled up to the dock nearest mine. Stays sharp, eyes already narrowed at my property. Travis stood at the bow, one foot propped up like he was posing for an HOA calendar. Morning, he shouted with fake cheerfulness. Morning, I called back casually. We noticed some interesting signage around your docks, he said, struggling to keep his tone light. Yep, renovations. He frowned. Renovations? Without approval. Don't need approval, I said, holding up my iced tea like a toast. County exempt. The boat went silent. Linda stepped forward, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. We're here to inspect your docks. Standard procedure. No, you're not, I replied calmly. You're here to trespass. Her jaw tightened. We have authority to. Your authority ends where my property line begins. I reached into a folder and lifted a laminated document so the sunlight made it gleam like something holy. County certification of exemption. Signed, dated, and filed. 10 copies. Travis's face reddened. There must be some mistake. There is, I said. You thinking you control anything here? One of the HOA men leaned over the boat's edge and squinted at the QR code on one of my signs. Travis? He has, like, a whole system here. Of course he does, Linda hissed. People like him always try to. To what? I cut in. Follow the law? Protect their property? Read the fine print you hoped I'd ignore. Her eyes flashed with rage. Travis tried to recover. Look, maybe we can reach an understanding. We already have one, I said. You stay off my land, off my docks, and out of my business. That's the understanding. Linda stepped forward again, pointing a finger at me. This isn't over. I know, I said, smiling, and I'm counting on that. Her mouth snapped shut. The boat revved, the engine growling like a frustrated child. They sped off, waves splashing violently against the dock posts. I watched them go, calm and unbothered, because I had just made my first move. Not loud, not dramatic, but precise, calculated, a chest opening that forced them into a corner without them realizing it. I went back inside the cabin and sat at my desk, staring at the lake through the wide front window. There was no fear in them all, just strategy. The HOA would retaliate. They always did. They couldn't stand losing control. Good. Let them try. Because out here, control belonged to whoever held the shoreline. And I held all of it. I opened my notebook and wrote at the top of the page, Phase 2, Restrict Access. Then I underlined it. Twice. This wasn't just a fence anymore. This was a siege. And they didn't know it yet, but I had only just begun. For the next 2 days, the lake remained eerily quiet. Too quiet. No motorboats. No HOA patrols. No clipboard-wielding invaders scanning my property like vultures circling carcass. If I hadn't known better, I would have believed they'd given up. But people like them never give up. They scheme. They plot. They regroup. And what they lack in ethics, they overcompensate for with persistence. On the morning of the third day, I woke to the distant rumble of engines echoing across the water. Not just one, several. I stepped onto the porch with my coffee, narrowing my eyes as 3 boats approached from the main side of the lake, all heading directly toward the cove where my cabin sat today. They weren't trying to hide this time. No stealth, no pretending it was a casual visit. This was an operation, and they wanted me to see it. The lead boat was bigger than the others, sleek, glossy, and obnoxiously polished. It bore a custom-printed banner that draped down its side. Holstead Lakeshore Community Improvement Initiative. I snorted. They were making it sound like a charity event. Behind it were 2 smaller boats, loaded with men in matching blue polos, toolboxes, clipboards, measuring tape, and more equipment than anyone needed to inspect anything. They weren't here to inspect. They were here to force a foothold on my shoreline. I didn't move from the porch. I just sipped my coffee and waited as the boats pulled into the neighboring docks, both owned by absent vacation homeowners who lived 3 states away and rarely visited. The HOA had long ago bullied them into submission. I wasn't surprised they were using those docks now as staging grounds. Travis was the first to step off the main boat. He shouted something to the others, pointing toward my docks as if directing soldiers on a battlefield. Good. Let them line up for their defeat. It wasn't long before he and Linda marched toward my property line, if you could call it that. As soon as they reached the invisible boundary between my land and the neighbors, they stopped, not because they respected it, but because they needed to gather their theatrics first. Travis cupped his hands around his mouth. We need to speak with you. I didn't answer. I made them wait until I finished my coffee. Then I set the mug down and walked to the edge of the porch. What? He plastered on his faux-friendly smile. We're here on official business. We've launched a community-wide improvement initiative for the lake. This means we'll need temporary access to all shoreline docks to install new safety rails and perform mandatory water depth testing. Sounds like a you problem, I said. Linda stepped forward, holding a stack of papers. This applies to every dock on the lake. No, I corrected. It applies to every dock under your jurisdiction. Not mine. Her smile vanished. If your docks aren't compliant with the new standards, we have the authority to. You don't have authority here. I pointed toward the cove. County records say so. I have all the documentation. Yes, she snapped, but the lake is public property. And the docks are not, I countered. Travis took a breath like a man trying to keep his composure. Look, we don't want conflict. Too late. He ignored the jab. We're trying to ensure safety for everyone. If your docks don't meet our guidelines, it compromises a whole lake. Then I guess the lake will just have to be compromised. The group behind him murmured among themselves. HOA members don't handle defiance well. They treat non-compliance like a personal insult. Linda shoved a stack of papers toward me. Hey, mandatory compliance forms. I didn't take them. In fact, I didn't even look at them. I'm not signing anything, I said. Now get off my property. Travis exhaled sharply. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Oh, I said, stepping off the porch and walking toward them slowly. I'm counting on the hard way. He blinked. Linda blinked. The whole group shifted uneasily. They weren't used to prey that walked toward a predator. I leaned in just enough that only the 2 of them could hear my voice. You picked the wrong shoreline. Travis's jaw clenched. We're giving you one last opportunity to cooperate. I grinned. and I'm giving you none. I turned my back on them and walked toward the docks. That's when I saw it, the moment that changed the game. While the leadership had been arguing with me, the smaller team had quietly floated one of their boats toward my dock, right up to the edge. They had a man crouched at the bow with a measuring tape already extended, reaching toward my dock post. He was inches away from touching it, inches away from trespassing, and they knew exactly what they were doing. I raised my voice. "Don't touch that dock." The man hesitated. Travis waved his arm wildly. "Go ahead. It's standard procedure." "No," I said louder, pointing at him. "That's a criminal offense." The man froze. The others looked between me and Travis. "Do it." Travis barked. "We have authority." "You don't," I said calmly. "But I do." I pulled out my phone. County sheriff is one button away. I already filed a preemptive property interference notice. That was true. Hazel had practically encouraged it. "If your man touches that dock," I continued, "I file." And then you explained to the sheriff why your community improvement initiative includes ignoring legally certified property boundaries. The man at the bow slowly reeled in his tape. Travis's face turned crimson. "This isn't over," he shouted. "You've said that before," I reminded him, "and we meant it." Linda added, furious. "Good," I said. "I'm just getting warmed up." They spent the next 10 minutes arguing among themselves before retreating to their boats. The engines roared to life, the sound echoing across the lake like an angry warning. As they disappeared around the bend, I walked back to the dock and rested a hand on one of the posts. They had shown me their next move, and now I knew exactly what to do. They wanted to use the lake? Fine. But if they wanted access, they'd have to go through me. They thought the docks were just pieces of wood floating on water. They didn't understand the truth. The docks were power. My power. And I was about to tighten my grip. I went back into the cabin, opened my notebook, flipped to a fresh page, and wrote, Phase 3, Blockade. Underneath it, I added, if they want a war on the water, they'll get one. By sunset, the lake had returned to its deceptive calm. The cove rippled with golden light, the water glowing like honey. Anyone who didn't know better would think it was a peaceful place, a sanctuary untouched by conflict. But beneath the surface, war was brewing, and I was preparing for the next strike. After the HOA's failed initiative, I knew they'd retaliate with something bigger, something that polished shoes and laminated rule sheets couldn't fix. They weren't going to stop. They couldn't. Their entire identity hinged on control, of lawns, of paint colors, of people. So I had to do something they wouldn't expect. I had to take control first. My blockade plan wasn't just about keeping them off my docks. It was about cutting off their supply lines. The HOA's boat access depended on this cove. They used the far-end launch ramps, but their members cut through my narrow channel every weekend to reach the deeper, wider section of the lake. Without my section of the shoreline, and without my docks, they'd lose half their access. And I was going to take all of it. I walked down to the water with a coil of rope, some buoys, and a handful of steel stakes. The county ordinance allowed for temporary safety barriers during renovation or wildlife observations. Hazel had practically winked when she explained how loosely defined those terms were. Translation: I had legal permission to block this entire channel for maintenance. So that's exactly what I did. It took the rest of the evening, working by lantern light, to drive stakes into the shallow lake bed on each side of my boundary and string the heavy rope between them. Then came the buoys, bright orange, impossible to ignore, each one labeled. Channel closed, property renovation in progress. Do not enter. I stepped back and admired my handiwork. It wasn't a fence. It wasn't aggressive. It was simply inconvenient. Inconvenient enough to make their lives harder. Legal enough that they couldn't tear it down without consequences. Visible enough that not even a drunk weekend boater could claim ignorance. I wasn't just defending my shoreline anymore. I was dividing the lake. By the time I finished, the sky was a vault of stars, and the water lapped gently against the newly placed buoys. My blockade swayed slightly, bobbing in the moonlight like a line drawn in the sand. Or water. They wanted a fight. Now they had won. The next morning, I didn't have to wait long. At 9:17 a.m., the first HOA boat arrived. I heard the engine before I saw it, high-pitched, irritated, like a wasp with an outboard motor. Then the boat appeared around a bend and slowed to a stop just outside the blockade. 3 board members stood at the bow: Travis, Linda, and a tall, wiry man I didn't recognize. I sipped my coffee from the dock, pretending not to notice them. Travis cupped his hands around his mouth. "You need to remove this." I raised my mug in greeting. "Good morning to you, too." "This blockade is illegal," he shouted. "Nope," I replied simply. Linda waved a clipboard like a weapon. "You can't obstruct a waterway. County says I can during renovation." "You're not renovating anything." "Sure I am," I said, gesturing to the dock. "I'm renovating the level of peace in my life." The new guy on their boat stepped forward. He had the kind of posture that suggested he thought he was important. He wore sunglasses even though the sun was behind clouds. "I'm Greg," he called, "head of Lakeshore Safety." "Congratulations," I said, "but I don't care." He ignored that. "We're going to have to remove this blockade." "Touch it," I said calmly, "and you'll be explaining to the county sheriff why you destroyed an approved safety installation." Travis threw his arms up. "You can't keep everyone from accessing this part of the lake." "Sure I can," I replied. "You just can't accept that I'm allowed to." Greg frowned. "We'll escalate this." I shrugged. "I assumed you would." "And we'll win," he threatened. "Now that," I said, "is the funniest thing you said yet." They sat in silence for a moment, the boat bobbing gently, their frustration so intense I could feel it across the water. Finally, Travis lost his temper. "You think you can isolate yourself from the community?" "Yes." "You think you can block our lake?" "No," I corrected. "I can block your access to my section of it." "This is ridiculous," he shouted. I smiled. "So go around." That was the nail in their coffin. There was no around. This channel cornered the deepest part of the lake. Their alternate route required navigating a shallow, rocky stretch filled with submerged logs. Only small kayaks and paddleboards could get through without tearing a motor off. Their power boats, those glossy symbols of HOA superiority, were effectively useless. Travis sputtered. "This is outrageous." "Good," I said, "because it's not coming down." They stared at me, completely powerless. "Delicious." Greg finally motioned toward the controls. "Let's go." Their boat peeled away in a spray of white foam, taking their fury with it. I finished my coffee and returned to the cabin to add a single line under Phase 3, blockade. Status, operational. Annoyingly effective, but I wasn't finished. The blockade was only one piece of the plan. I knew the HOA well enough to predict their next move. They'd escalate to legal threats, public pressure, maybe even counter-level manipulation. And when that failed, as it would, they'd turn to something desperate, something sloppy, something exploitable. I needed a way to trap them, not just inconvenience them. I needed evidence, undeniable, irrefutable proof of their wrongdoing. And I had the perfect bait. I walked outside, grabbed an old, unused dock plank, and laid it conspicuously near the shoreline where anyone could see it. Then I added a sign. "Dock materials, do not remove, under renovation audit." Nothing triggered HOA members more than forbidden materials lying out in the open. They lived for moments like this, and I was counting on that. Then I set up a trail camera in the tree line, angled perfectly at the shoreline. The camera would activate at the slightest motion, capturing anyone foolish enough to step onto my property. And the HOA was nothing if not foolish when they felt threatened. Everything was in place now. The blockade, the bait, the surveillance. All that remained was waiting. And waiting was easy when you knew your enemy couldn't sit still. As the sun dipped behind the trees that evening, the lake once again turned orange and quiet. The air grew still, but underneath that stillness was a tension so thick you could slice it. Tomorrow, they would make their next move. Tomorrow, I would catch them breaking the law. Tomorrow, the war on the water would become official. And as I looked out over the lake, my blockade floating proudly, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Victory. Not the final one. Not yet. but the kind that tasted like control, the kind that tasted like revenge. The lake had never looked so still. The sun had barely crested the horizon when I stepped onto my dock, coffee in hand, surveying my blockade like a general inspecting his front line. For days, the HOA had tried to assert control, and for days, I had denied them every inch. But today, the final act would unfold. I didn't have to wait long. By mid-morning, I saw them. 3 boats rounding the bend, engines growling with barely concealed anger. Travis, Linda, and Greg led the charge, their polished exteriors masking a fury I could practically taste from here. Behind them were 4 smaller boats carrying what could only be described as a weekend warriors of Halstead's Lakeside elite. They had come prepared with measuring tapes, clipboards, and a sense of entitlement so thick it could choke a man. But I was ready. I had spent the previous night reviewing the footage from the trail camera. Every inch of my property was under surveillance, every motion logged. I knew the moment someone stepped beyond the legal boundary. I knew which of them were likely to act rashly, and I had arranged the bait dock plank perfectly. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting them fume silently from a distance. They were circling, waiting for me to make a move. Travis waved his arms dramatically. "We're giving you one last chance. Remove the blockade or face consequences." I set my mug down on the dock and smiled. "I already told you, I'm renovating. It's fully authorized. County approved." Linda's face twisted in frustration. "That's not true. This is harassment." "Harassment," I replied calmly, "is when someone steps onto property they don't own." And that's exactly what happened next. Greg, the head of Lakeshore Safety, had the audacity to reach toward the orange boy marking my blockade. He leaned over the edge of his boat, inches from stepping into the channel. That motion triggered the trail camera I had placed the night before. A flash went off, invisible to him, capturing the exact moment he attempted to trespass. I smiled. "Perfect timing. You've stepped onto private property," I shouted, holding up a second camera for visual confirmation. "One more step, and we're filing with the sheriff." Travis and Linda's faces turned red. They looked at Greg, then back at me. You can't do that." Linda yelled. "Sure I can," I said, flipping open my folder full of county-approved documents and screenshots from the trail camera. "And I will." Travis sputtered. "You're bluffing." I wasn't. I had legal proof, photographic evidence, and public documentation ready to file immediately. Their bluff had crumbled before their eyes, and I could see the uncertainty start to ripple through their formation. And then I struck the next part of my plan. I had called a local paper the previous evening, explaining that an illegal attempt to seize private docks was about to happen. I wasn't exaggerating. They had arrived at my cabin with boats, measuring tapes, and a sense of entitlement. By the time the first camera flash went off, a small news crew arrived in kayaks, cameras rolling. The HOA's reaction was instantaneous. Shock, embarrassment, fury, all perfectly captured on video. "Do you see this?" I asked the reporter as she paddled closer. "These people claim they have authority over my property. They don't. County record confirm it. And here they are, violating the law to get what they want." The reporter nodded, filming. "That's incredible. We've been covering Lakeshore dispute for years, but this is something else." Travis's face was purple. "This is unbelievable," he shouted. "We're trying to protect the community." "Yes," I said softly, "by breaking the law. I get it." Linda's eyes darted around, searching for a way to reclaim control, but there wasn't one. Their boats were hemmed in by my blockade, their credibility shredded by both evidence and witnesses. Even the so-called weekend warriors were quiet, suddenly aware that their leader's grand plan had failed spectacularly. I walked toward the edge of the dock, camera in hand, my steps deliberate and slow. "Here's the deal," I said. "You stay off my property. You stay off my docks. You stay off my channel. Any attempt to bypass the blockade, and this footage goes directly to the county sheriff and the local press. Anyone attempting to interfere with my renovation project is legally accountable." There was a pause. Silence thick enough to taste. Then Travis muttered, We'll reconsider our approach." I nodded. "Good. Because whatever you try next, it won't work." Linda, furious, turned her back and gestured wildly to the boats. They retreated, engines whining as they circled out of my cove, back to safer waters. Their morale was shattered, their sense of superiority gone. I could almost feel a collective humiliation radiating off the water. Once they were out of sight, I walked back to the cabin and poured myself another drink. The adrenaline had been exhilarating. Victory, even if partial, tasted sweet. But revenge wasn't just about winning a single battle. It was about sending a message. And I had one more move planned. I called Hazel, the county clerk, and explained the full sequence of events: attempted trespass, unauthorized measurements, the trail camera footage, and the blockade. Within hours, the county had issued a formal warning to the Halstead Lakeshore Community Improvement Initiative, citing violations and unauthorized access. Then, I submitted the video evidence to the local paper. Within 2 days, the story ran: HOA attempts to seize private docks foiled by property owner. The headline was glorious. Travis's face, caught mid-yell at my blockade, became an infamous image in the local news. Linda's dramatic finger-pointing was captured for all posterity. The backlash was immediate. The HOA's credibility was in tatters. Members complained, resigned, and quietly sought ways to avoid attention. For the first time, I realized something important. Power, like water, always seeks a path of least resistance. And by taking control of the docks, I had redirected the flow entirely. I sat back on my dock, looking at the water shimmer beneath the afternoon sun. My blockade still floated, sturdy and untouched. The bait plank lay exactly where I had placed it, a subtle reminder of the trap I had set. The lake was mine, for now. And in that moment, I understood the full weight of what revenge truly meant. It wasn't about rage. It wasn't about yelling off threats. It was about patience, strategy, control, turning someone else's arrogance into their downfall. They had underestimated me. They had assumed compliance. They had assumed fear. And now, they had learned a lesson that would echo across Halstead Lake for years. Never underestimate a man who knows his property and knows how to defend it. As the sun dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across my cabin and dock, I raised my glass one last time. To the lake, to the blockade, to patience, and most of all, to revenge. Because in the end, it wasn't just about keeping control of the docks. It was about reclaiming my life from people who thought they could dictate it. And that, I realized, was a victory far sweeter than I had imagined. The HOA was still out there, plotting, frustrated, angry, but they would never again see me as weak. And I didn't just win this battle. I had reminded them that arrogance has a cost. The lake was quiet again. The docks were mine. And the tide of revenge had finally come in.